Okay, so today starts our real dive into forests of North America. And like I said, Module 3 is going to focus on forests of the Southeastern United States. And so we're going to start with the Southeastern coastal plain today. So first, before we get started, today's tree trivia. What tree is celebrated in the official North Carolina State toast? Not NC State, but the North Carolina State toast. So the answer to that is the longleaf pine, Pinus palustris. Also, if you are recognized in North Carolina, the highest civic honor in the state is called the Order of the Longleaf Pine, and that actually authorizes you to give the toast, which actually has many verses, but the first verse that everyone's familiar with is, "Here's to the land of the longleaf pine, the summer land where the sun doth shine, where the weak grow strong and the strong grow great. Here's to down home, the old North State." So today we're going to, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the forest types in the Southeastern coastal plain that we'll focus on. So that will be this lecture and then the next lecture. And today we'll focus on longleaf, loblolly, and slash pine forests with a special focus on the longleaf pine today. This is a truly special species, one that has a really interesting history as well as ecology and long human history and natural history. For all of the forest types that we look at in this set of lectures, we're going to talk about the species composition. So what are the main species that define that forest type? We will talk about the forest structure. What does that forest look like? The environmental factors that make that forest type occur where it does. So that helps explain why it is where it is. We started talking about that in the last lecture. And then finally, the disturbance regime. And there may be other things that are unique to each community that we'll focus on. But as you're studying these communities, those are the main things that I want you to focus on and know. And so this photo is a photo of Peter McNeary, a forest management senior in forestry summer camp in the Croatan National Forest, looking at this special forest type that includes longleaf. So remember, today's lecture, we're going to focus on the coastal plain. Both the tidewater area as well as the intercoastal plain has the forest types that we're going to be looking at. And so I just want to separate the set of lectures as focusing on the two regions of the coastal plain, the tidewater area and intercoastal plain. And so, you know, in a lot of maps, it'll classify all these forests as one type, and that is the Southeastern evergreen forest. This was done as early as 1950 by Emma Lucy Braun, and you can see here in the yellow, the Southeastern evergreen forest. And so when we characterize it as one community type, we can describe it as occurring from basically the James River down to eastern Texas, although you can see that Florida has different types of forests since it's more tropical. And most of these forests, you know, they are different depending on where you are, but they have an evergreen tree as a dominant or co-dominant species. And, you know, most of the soils of the coastal plain are old or ancient sand dunes, right, from periods of lower and higher sea level. There are definitely some silts and clays, but there's also pockets where there's really deep organic soils, and that results in a completely different forest type that you can pinpoint based on the soil. So we're going to, for our study of the Southeastern evergreen forest, we're going to look at 5 to 7 types, depending on how much time we have. Today we'll focus on longleaf, loblolly, and slash pine, right? These are similar evergreen forest types that stretch through the Southeastern United States. Then we will look at some other unique types, including maritime forest, cypress gum, pocosin, Atlantic white cedar, and bottomland hardwood forest. So those are all the forest types that we will look at in the coastal plain of the Southeastern US. Now in the coastal plain, you might not think that topography matters a whole lot, but actually the microtopography can make a big difference in terms of what kind of forest you would expect on a certain site. Other things that are important, of course, are hydrology, right? How wet that forest type is. The soils, as I mentioned earlier, whether they're mineral, organic soils, and then disturbance, right? So those are the 4 main factors that separate out these different forest types that I've listed here. So today we're going to focus on longleaf, loblolly, and slash pine. So can you ask yourself, is moisture a factor in the Southeastern coastal plain? This is a map from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and you can see that the green areas are areas that are predominantly wetland. So I think the development that we've seen in the coastal North Carolina kind of masks the fact that most of this area would be classified as a wetland. And so hydrology is, of course, a huge factor in the coastal plain when you're looking at different forest types. So first, I'm going to talk about the characteristics that these different forest types share. They look quite similar. There are key differences among them, but first we'll talk about the characteristics that all of these forest types share. So they can range, the hydrology can range from very dry to seasonally wet. They almost always occur on mineral soils. So these are not, you are not going to find any of these forest types on deep organic soils. They just don't thrive there. Those trees are not competitive in organic soils. Generally, when we're talking about establishment, how do these forests get started? These are all early successional species. Pines in general are shade intolerant, and so they can be naturally regenerated, right, through the copious amounts of pine seed or planted. And then disturbance is a variable depending on the forest type. Longleaf pine has very frequent fire, frequent disturbance on a scale of 1 to 3 years. If fire is suppressed, you will end up with loblolly pine or slashed pine, depending on where you are geographically. So that's a really key delimiter in separating out these 3 different types, right? So if you have fire suppression going on, you're going to end up with loblolly or slash pine. Loblolly will be in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Slash pine gets down into Florida and also Georgia. These forest lands traditionally are extremely valuable. Any kind of pine that's sold out of this, if you go to Home Depot, it will be sold as southern yellow pine. So that could be any of these 3 species. And we're going to talk about longleaf separately because it is such a different forest type, but they are all southern yellow pines. They are all part of a southeastern evergreen forest type. So southern yellow pine is extremely valuable, and it can include any of the species. So we mentioned longleaf, loblolly, and slash pine. Also includes shortleaf, which is more of a Piedmont species. And it's known for having this reddish yellow to reddish brown heartwood with a whitish yellow sapwood. It is used for a number of different products, right? So everything from dimension lumber, poles and pilings, but also pulp. The foliage is also harvested as pine straw mulch. And this has always been a valuable species even before industrial times. So pine straw baskets were used in Native American basketry. And I linked an article here from the Lumbee tribe about that tradition of pine straw baskets. But then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other traditional uses of these types of southern yellow pines. So this is, first we'll talk about slash pine, Pinus elliottii. This is a species that we'll learn by cone, I think, in lab. And so this is the southern end of the southeastern evergreen forest. You can see it's not found in North Carolina. That kind of blue-green color for the counties in North Carolina indicates that it was planted. It's not a natural occurrence there. And if you go into a slash pine forest, you're going to think it looks a lot like a loblolly pine forest that you would find in North Carolina. Some of the characteristics it shares with loblolly is that it is fire intolerant. So in an area that has regular fire, it will invade the sites that don't burn regularly. It also co-occurs some of the other species that are in slash pine forests are oaks, also sweet gum and red maple. As we mentioned earlier, mineral soil, shade tolerant, and this is a very commercially valuable species. So that's slash pine or Pinus elliottii. If you compare longleaf versus loblolly pine as far as the range maps, there's something going on here with these southern pines in Georgia. If you look back at the slash pine, you can see it's only in those coastal counties, and kind of the same for longleaf versus loblolly. So I'm not quite sure what the story is there, but it's something I should probably look into. You can see that loblolly and longleaf pine geographically overlap a good bit. Longleaf is a little bit more of a southern species, right, where loblolly naturally ranges up into the Chesapeake Bay. So there's that comparison, and I think both of them, yeah, range into Florida and then also the Gulf states. The longleaf pine range is slightly narrower than loblolly. So let's talk about loblolly pine next. This is Pinus taeda, which we learned the first week of lab, partly because this is the most important commercial species in the United States, and it's certainly a special focus here at NC State. Many of you who study forest management will learn more than you ever wanted to know about producing this species commercially. But historically, loblolly wasn't all, it was widespread, but it was limited in where it could live. It was mostly found along rivers, and that's because there it was protected from fire. Loblolly pine is not a fire-tolerant species. But over time, loblollies replaced longleaf pine because of a policy of fire suppression, and also because it has a pretty established silviculture. So it's very easily and readily grown in plantations. And so most of the pines that you see when you're driving around North Carolina and most of the Southeast are loblolly pine, or in the South, slash pine plantations. It also grows a lot faster than longleaf. So we've figured out a lot more about how to grow loblolly pine. And a lot of that research on silviculture and genetics has taken place here at NC State. So the Tree Improvement Cooperative has done some important genetic work. Forest Productivity Co-op has done a lot of research on silviculture. So other trees do occur with loblolly, not so much in plantations where they're suppressed, right, actively, but if you see a stand that's regenerated on its own, you also see red maple, sweet gum, water oak, some other oaks. That exact mix of species depends on the moisture of that site. Loblolly tends to form denser forest stands than longleaf, so you're going to see a pretty dense forest structure. Like the other pines, that grows only on mineral soil and it's shade intolerant, so you're not going to see you will not walk into a stand of loblolly pine in the shank, for example, and see pine seedlings on the ground, right? They need open. And so loblolly pine regenerates. It's traditionally been called old field pine. That's one of its common names because it was the species that came in after agricultural abandonment, which happened in a really big extent in the 1930s during the Depression. But it's also very much planted extensively all over the Southeastern United States in plantations. And if you let these forests go and don't harvest them, it will eventually succeed to a mixed pine oak forest, right? So the oaks will start seeding in, they are shade tolerant, so they can grow up in the understory, and eventually they will outlive the pines. And so eventually, if you don't harvest this forest, it will succeed to an oak hickory forest. So let's talk more about longleaf pines. Pinus palustris, this is a truly special species. This photograph is of the grass stage of longleaf pine. This pine used to cover 90,000 acres in the Southeastern coastal plain. It was the dominant species. And when we think about longleaf pine, if you take forest communities, we'll learn several types. But for here, we're going to talk about two main types of longleaf pine forest, the savannas as well as the flatwoods. And those are distinguished primarily by moisture, right? So savannas are the moist sites for longleaf. They have a grassy understory. They have scattered trees so that it's very open forest. It's really a beautiful forest to be in. And there's not a lot of species that are in the mid-story. So there's no shrub layer or things like that. On the other hand, the flatwoods are much drier sites. They do have a shrubby understory. So these are often the longleaf sites that you'll see in the sand hills, where there's a shrubby understory that has a lot of oaks, a lot of species in the Ericaceae family. And one of the things that makes longleaf pine unique is this grass stage that you can see here on the right. It has this grass stage, and it will sit in that grass stage for several years until conditions are right. Then it pops out of that grass stage and grows very rapidly. Once it reaches maturity, it's a very long-lived species. So, on the order of several hundred years old. So much longer lived than either loblolly pine or slash pine. But a key component of this forest type that is required is disturbance. and disturbance in the form of fire. So longleaf pine requires frequent low intensity fires. So keep that in mind. So longleaf has several fire adaptations. It has that grass stage. You can see that the foliage, remember in lab, we talked about the foliage of longleaf as being as long as your forearm. So 12 inches, 18 inches even is common. And that long, lush foliage protects the apical meristem, that white bud, bright white bud, that is how we know longleaf pine. And so that makes it fire tolerant. So these trees can sit in the grass stage, and fires that are low can kind of burn over them, and that foliage protects the bud, and the pine will regrow its leaves and it will be just fine. In fact, a 1 to 3 year fire cycle is perfectly natural and normal for a longleaf pine stand. So the reason why it's a fire species is not so much that it likes fire, but the fact that it can live and tolerate fire. Longleaf pine inherently is a poor competitor, right? So that means that it doesn't do well with competition from other species. So the function of fire in this case is basically to knock back competitors. Longleaf pine is inherently shade intolerant, so any kind of shrubs that grow faster than longleaf are going to out-compete it, and the stand won't do well. So I'll show you some pictures of that in a moment. The kinds of fires that longleaf pine is adapted for are these low-level fires. So you can see this is not a canopy or crown fire. This fire is burning low, burning off that grassy understory, but importantly, it's killing off any kinds of shrubs or other tree species that might grow faster and outcompete longleaf. So this is a photo of a savanna. So this is one of these wet sites. And you can see the structure also, that it's got scattered canopy trees, but the canopy is not closed. And then the understory is grassy, really nothing to speak of in the midstory. These can be really beautiful places with really high diversity. Of all the plant communities in the South, I think North America and probably the world, the longleaf pine savanna has the greatest diversity in small areas. So what that means is if I took a meter stick, or let's even say a hula hoop, and threw it into the center of this forest, I could look on the ground and count possibly 100 different species within that hoop. These are incredibly diverse communities on the small scale. If you look at diversity of the canopy, it's not diverse at all. There's one species, longleaf pine. But the understory with this frequent fire really favors this incredible lush diversity. And some really important and unusual species are in that savanna type community. Here's more pictures of the types of plants that are in these savannas. You can see pitcher plants in the stand on the left, and actually, so those are some of the flowers that are in kind of that reddish rust color. You have these beautiful orchids that are shown in the photo on the right. So again, you can see the structure of this stand is a very open canopy, which allows sunlight to get down to the herb layer. There are some, this is my gratuitous wildlife photo. There's some special wildlife species that favor longleaf pine communities, and that includes the gopher tortoise in southern, not North Carolina, but in the southern states, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and then into the Gulf states, and then the red cockaded woodpecker on the right, which might be familiar to many of you. These are species that must have the habitat of longleaf pine in order to survive. And so unsurprisingly, as longleaf pine has disappeared, these species have been endangered. The flatwoods areas, you might look and think superficially that these look very similar. On this photo on the left, though, you can see that there's some evergreen shrubs that are popping up here. These sites are also burned, but not on the frequency. And if you dig into the soil here, it's a very sandy, dry soil. So moisture doesn't seem to be much of a factor for longleaf pine. On the right, you can see what I call the teenager longleaf pine that's busting out of the grass stage. At this point, it is actually susceptible to fire. So it grows very, very rapidly through this stage until it's a mature tree. and puts on, you know, some heavy bark, so that will end up protecting it, and then it is protected from fire. But in this sort of in-between stage, it is actually susceptible to fire. This is what happens if you suppress fire or don't allow fire to occur in one of these longleaf sites. You can see the canopy is still longleaf, but it is rapidly being taken over by these shrubby species. So these species are often in the Ericaceae family. They are often evergreen shrubs. So once they take hold of a site, they're very difficult to get rid of. They often have kind of a waxy coated foliage that makes them very hard to burn, very hard to treat with herbicide because it doesn't penetrate that coat. There's also some oak species that are competitive, and red maple that will grow up in this type of environment and eventually suppress the longleaf pine. Some more photos of these loblolly pine longleaf pine flatwoods. On the left, you can see this is a site that's in farther south. You can see the saw palmetto as the understory plant. And then on the right, you can see a site that, you know, really needs, you know, it's kind of crying out for restoration. Someone to come in and probably cut the trees that are competing with it and then either do a burn or some kind of treatment to get rid of those shrubs. Species that co-occur with longleaf pine on these flatwoods are turkey oak, Quercus laevis. This is a classic sandhills oak species, and it loves, doesn't seem to mind these really, really dry sites. You can see on the right that there's, you know, it's already providing shade, and so that longleaf pine, those longleaf pine seedlings aren't going to thrive very well in that shady habitat, but that's really common. Looking at the map again, you can see the historic range of longleaf pine through the southeastern United States, and then the current range. This is a map provided by the Longleaf Foundation, and it shows the green areas that are significant components of longleaf. So less than 3% of the land that was historically longleaf is left. So this is really an endangered ecosystem. We can see areas where it's still lush and thriving, but that's because of conservation actions and also management. So you can see the areas with the largest green dots are 1 million acres. In North Carolina in the Sandhills, that area is primarily Fort Bragg. Is a very important conservation site for longleaf pine, and also the Bladen Lakes area where Jones Lake State Park is. And then kind of zooming in on this, you can see this a little bit more clearly. You can see the historic range of longleaf pine shown with the slash, right? So this species really covered much of the southeastern United States. You can see in North Carolina, it's kind of interesting. It's more of an intercoastal plain species and not out on the Outer Banks or even that neck in like Tyrrell County and Columbia. Those are organic soils, which longleaf does not like. And so you can see that the people who are working on longleaf are trying to ensure connectivity of the remaining sites for longleaf pine. The light green is showing federally managed lands, so that's important. And then, you know, what are the areas that are preserved and how are they conserved? My husband grew up in the Francis Marion National Forest in Berkeley County, which is another big remaining area for longleaf pine. So why is longleaf pine so rare today? Why has it been reduced to 3% of its historic range? Well, you've heard me speak about fire suppression. This is a policy that was ill-advised, right? Thinking that, oh, we're going to conserve the forest by making sure it doesn't burn. This was before we understood how important fire was for longleaf pine. But also we have some commercial industries that have impacted longleaf pine, resulting in its destruction. The naval stores industry we'll talk about was really important up until the Civil War, and this impacted longleaf pine. And then post-Civil War, as railroads became more viable and used for transportation and hauling lumber out, there was a rapid conversion as the old growth stands of longleaf were cut and converted. Another impact that people don't really think about is grazing hogs during colonial times. So people used to let their livestock run free, and wild hogs really like the fleshy, very nutritious buds of longleaf pine. So they ate a lot of longleaf pine in the grass stage. Hard to know exactly quantify that impact, but it was a significant impact to be sure. So let's talk a little bit about the naval stores industry in North Carolina, which gives us our name, the Tarheel State. We're talking about naval stores, right? This is not a place to go buy Navy themed apparel, right? Naval stores industry is tar, pitch, turpentine, and rosin. So these are all products that were used in shipbuilding that were made from pine sap in different ways. We'll talk about a little bit more than that. Longleaf pine was the best and most abundant source for these naval stores. And this was a major export during colonial times. So this was one of the big products that fueled the colonies to support the British Navy. So bounties were paid to the colonies to produce naval stores, and North Carolina led that production. So at one time, North Carolina produced over 90% of the naval stores products. This industry collapsed after the Civil War in the 1890s, but this was a major industry, probably the most important industry in the state up through the Civil War, more so than even agriculture. So when you produce naval stores, you cut the trees. You can see that tree on the right is cut in kind of a herringbone pattern. So you scrape and then the tree produces its resin. You cut this cavity, and each year you cut a little bit higher on the tree to keep that resin flowing. So that results in what they call the cat face scar. And you can still find trees, old trees out in the woods that have the cat face scar that shows that it used to be tapped for resin. And then they put these little gutters and clay pots underneath to collect the resin. So a number of products can be made with the pine resin from longleaf pine. So you can make tar if you burn logs in tar kilns, also called tarkins. This was used in shipbuilding to plug leaks, right? So oakum is developed from that. So they pound rope into the seams and then cover it with tar to seal it. It also helps the wood resist decay. So it was often just used as a general coating on ships, coated ropes to protect it, and later roofing, right? So this is basically a preservative. You can boil the tar down to thicken it into pitch, which makes it solid at room temperature. And then you can paint it onto surfaces to use for waterproofing. So this is also used very frequently in wood and shipbuilding. The turpentine industry was an entirely different industry. I've just been reading Larry Early's book on looking for longleaf. And so this was used as a fuel source for illumination from 1800 to about 1860, when it was replaced with kerosene. And that was also used in a solvent and an antiseptic. And then finally, we have rosin, which is a kind of a sticky byproduct from making turpentine. So the bulk of this industry was performed by enslaved Africans and African Americans. This is very difficult, very labor intensive, backbreaking work. And this industry collapsed after the Civil War when the labor economy shifted. The forests were also exhausted, right? They can be tapped for a number of years. Often during this time, those forests became logged and then converted over to agriculture. And then the illuminant for the turpentine industry was replaced by kerosene. So in the end, right, we have less than 3% of the longleaf pine that remains of the former 90,000 acres. So there's a lot of work afoot now to restore longleaf, and I linked the Longleaf Coalition, which partners with the Forest Service to promote restoration projects and also get into the science of growing longleaf pine. And I've got a video here linked that we'll watch. And so that is kind of our conclusion with the first forest types, the Southeastern coastal plain, right? Breaking down that kind of broad forest type, the Southeastern evergreen forest, into recognizing that this is a forest that can be dominated by one of three species, longleaf pine traditionally, then loblolly and slash pine. We talked about the different species composition of these forests, the structure, which differs between longleaf versus loblolly and slash, the environmental factors that put those forest types where they are, and then the disturbance that's really necessary to keep those forests intact. And so I hope you enjoyed learning about longleaf pine today, a really important species. And that is a wrap for today.